Yeah, Matt, I would just give everybody a couple minutes to filter in, and then I should have made some nice music for the opening.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. For those of you joining, thank you so much for joining us. This is Gray Area's Patch Connect, a meetup where we get to explore the works of three inspiring artists. We're in for a big treat tonight. But before I get to that, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Matthew Ganucheau. I helped build the education program at Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. And I'm an art educator where I have taught at a variety of places, including UC Davis, California College of the Arts, and I currently teach at Stanford in the Experimental Media Lab of the Art and Art History Department. Um, and today or this evening, for those of you in the East Coast, we have three amazing artists that are pushing the boundaries of their own tools. Uh, these unique and inspiring artists, you're going to see, they're going to showcase a variety of work that's going to be in a variety of different mediums, everything from computer vision, artificial intelligence, and spatial thinking. Each of these artists are strongly driven not just by the results and the works that they create, but also the research that they put into these works, exploring across a large amount of mediums. For our first artist, oh, actually, I wanted to say before we begin there, um, You can ask questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. There's a little button at the bottom. It's to the right of the chat. And we're going to have a brief moment for questions at the end of each speaker. In addition, Seabrook will be posting a donation link, and you can donate, and all proceeds will be going to the artists. So I encourage you to both participate and support the artist. With that said, first up, we have an amazing artist whose work is more relevant now than ever, Mimi Onuoha. Let's see. She is a Nigerian-American artist whose research work highlights the social relationships and power dynamics behind data collection. Her multimedia practice uses print, code, installation, and video to call attention to the ways in which those in the margin are differently abstracted, represented, and missed by socio-technological systems. And she quite recently had an amazing post in 538, which has become a required reading for all of my students, and I highly recommend you all check it out as well. With that said, I'd like to introduce Mimi.
Hi, everyone. So nice to be here. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone, great area team, and anyone who's listening tonight. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, and cool. Y'all can see my name? Everything is good?
Looks great.
Cool, thank you. Okay, yeah, thank you again, everyone. I am going to be presenting some kind of newer work tonight, which is always like a little bit nerve-wracking. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being guinea pigs to that. And the project that I'm about to present, that I really want to present tonight, is called The Future is Here. Just a warning, the next slide is pretty flashy, like literally. So really, this is a piece, it's a video piece that I actually showed towards the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020 in London. And it's really kind of grounded in this idea of who is the future for, which we could also, well, which I like to think about in a couple different questions. It says, who is the future for? But really, I'm also thinking about what does it take to create the future? And who do narratives about the future include? And part of the reason why I'm really interested in this question is that my name is Mimi Onuoha. I'm an artist, I'm a researcher, and I spend a lot of time working with emerging technology, working with things that are the recently possible, or things that are sort of supposed to be the tools of technology of the future. And a lot of my work, I'm really interested in sort of the social structures that those technologies reveal, or I'd like to focus a lot on things like data collection and try to pick out what that reveals about the hierarchies that color our world. But in particular, in thinking about the future in this piece, I was really thinking about narratives around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so to explain this, I kind of want to go back a little bit and talk about a different piece that I did a few years ago that is definitely relevant to what I'm going to talk about tonight. That piece was called A People's Guide to Artificial Intelligence. I believe it was published in 2016. Honestly, what is time nowadays? Hard to know. I think it was 2016 or 2017 maybe. And at the time, I published this with my really wonderful collaborator, Diana Nucera, who also goes by the name Mother Cyborg. And what we did was create A People's Guide to AI, and it was intended to be this comprehensive beginner's guide to understanding AI and other data-driven systems. And our whole idea of creating this was really to provide people with a kind of rigorous introduction to AI and machine learning that also could be friendly and like something that could be used by a lot of different groups, but that also was really, really grounded in thinking about equity and thinking about power and thinking about how different people are constituted and affected by technologies. And so part of why we did this is because it tied with a lot of the work that we were doing at the time. Diana worked for the Detroit Community Technology Project, where she was doing a lot of fantastic work around mesh networks and thinking about internet accessibility and infrastructure for various communities. And I was doing a lot of work around data collection, participatory work, and art pieces with people. And so we found ourselves in a lot of spaces with stakeholders, people talking about AI, talking about machine learning, and really talking about these technologies as things that were going to change the world, things that were absolutely like the cutting edge, the future, just really the things that everyone needed to be focused on. And just there was quite a lot of rhetoric around this. And also as a result of that, we found ourselves both pretty enmeshed in a lot of the narratives around these technologies. So, one of the main ones was this, like AI is being used to insert whatever cool thing. You still see this around, you see lots of articles like this now. Or this one was like another favorite one that we would encounter. Robots are gonna take our jobs. Like this is the future, automation, AI, what are we gonna do? This AI takeover theme really kind of kept coming back. And so in the guide that we did, we made sure that we kind of got away from the hype and the narratives around those and tried to really break down what do these things mean. And we focused on trying to pin down what do people mean when they talk about artificial intelligence. And also nowadays when people talk about artificial intelligence, they tend to mean machine learning. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. So I want to say a little bit about this just to make sure we're all on the same page, because the work I want to talk about does deal a lot with machine learning. And machine learning, if you don't know, it's a field of AI, it's a subset. And really, very broadly, is based around computer programs generating rules and predictions based on raw data that has been fed into them. And so those predictions are based on data that has already been classified and tagged in the right ways, which I'll talk a bit about later. But if you use a smartphone, in general, you've probably interacted with machine learning systems. These kind of ones on the left, you can see things. If you hear anything about facial recognition, we're usually talking about machine learning, or different kinds of computational translation, language translation. That also falls into this space. And so in A People's Guide, we spent a lot of time talking about the difference between AI and machine learning, really breaking this down for people. And one of the things that we really tried to highlight a lot was this idea that as these computer programs are making sense of this data and then creating these rules and predictions based on those data, maybe doing things like image classification, facial recognition, as I said, or a whole slew of different algorithms around that, they still can only work with the data that they've been supplied. And so we really talked about this in the sense that there's so much information in the world, but these machine learning algorithms can only make sense of the data that they're given. And all of these images that I'm showing with the cats, they come from A People's Guide to AI, which is online. It's free, anyone can download it. So if you're interested, you can absolutely do that. So again, we're talking about this, trying to make sense of this idea, this data supplied, that these machine learning algorithms can only work on the data that they've been given. They can only make predictions based on that. But the thing that we didn't get to in the book, the thing that we didn't really have time to talk enough about, was really what that process really looks like on a large scale. And I'm kind of showing an example here. This is an image from Salmonsource, which is a company that does a lot of, helps do a lot of work around machine learning and kind of leveraging the space so that other companies can use these technologies. And you can see here, this is an example of of image recognition. So you've got these different images, you've got different things, and they're being tagged and identified for what they are. So you can see there's a vehicle car that's different than a pedestrian, that's different than a vehicle cable car, which is different than, you can see that other vehicle car in the background. And the thing that we didn't really get to in A People's Guide, something that we didn't have time to go into, was the fact that if you're going to build an image classification system and it's going to be based on these, then you need to know what each of these images are. And actually, it's humans who tend to do that work. Like that is really a laborious task. That is a task that we call annotating data sets, or labeling, or doing this sort of baseline, making sense of the data so that you can feed it into these systems and then have things done with them. And that is really laborious. And in a lot of cases, not all, you need your data to be tagged, to be labeled, to be annotated in just the right way. And so it becomes really important to have people do that. And so there are all these companies whose job is to kind of fill in that gap and connect different entities that want to make use of machine learning with what they call like human intelligence, or some of them use different names. But a lot of these companies, they exist to make it easier for other companies to use machine learning. But what they really do is connect companies, usually in the West, that are trying to use these algorithms with various groups of people, usually in the global South, who are doing the tasks of labeling and tagging these data sets and doing it for usually really small amounts of money. And so this, as I said, this is where we didn't quite get to in the guide, but even a few years later, I still found myself personally just so interested in this idea. And that was this idea of machine learning and the fact that it really, almost everywhere I see it presented in a more kind of colloquial, like lay person sense, but also even in some of the more like stakeholder meetings I would be in, is always very solidly presented. Machine learning is always presented as this technology of the future. And I found myself really interested in the fact that despite that, it really is built upon labor that comes mostly from the global South, and mostly from sites that aren't commonly associated with these ideas of modernity and futurity. And so I wanted to create a work that focused specifically on those sites of labor, which are absolutely the sites that made machine learning at scale possible, and focus on where those things were happening. And so that's why I got to this piece, which is called The Future is Here. And so the future, the here that I'm talking about are really the sites where people who work for these companies, where they are tagging and annotating these data sets for small amounts of money. The future is here is referring to the here of where those people work. And so this was the piece that I made. I made this for the Photographers Gallery. As I said, it's based in London. And this ended up being a video piece. And what I really did for it was I went on some of these same platforms and I signed up on them both as somebody who was doing some like data annotation and also somebody who was like requesting the services. And what I did was I asked people, specifically people who were had been doing a really large amount of this work. I asked them if they would send me photos of the places where they were working. And so this is an example of the kind of photo that I received back. This is, you can see it's a shop. This is an image that somebody who worked for the company, which was Figure 8, now has been taken over by another company called Appen. And this is one of the images that they sent me. Crucially, you'll notice that I'm going to show a few more of these images. None of them have images of the people included in them, which was a really, really intentional decision. I'm not really trying to speak for those people. I'm not trying to speak for their experiences. I'm really speaking more about the structural nature and global hierarchies that go into building this system, which really is a global one. So this is an example of one place. Here's another image. This is here. Both of these images come from Venezuela. I also asked people if they would tell me where they were based. And one of the things that I noticed, this is really consistent with a lot of work that academics have done around this same type of labor. Around 80% of the folks who sent in images were based in Venezuela. And that makes a lot of sense. I did this collection process around the end of 2019. And it's worth noting that Venezuela as a country made just absolute sense to be a site of a lot of this, in that it's a country that had a strong middle class that at the time had relatively recently faced a huge conflict and economic recession. And so you have loads of people who have the skills and the time to do remote work, as well as the technical infrastructure and the need for income. And so it made sense, as I said, about 80%. Some of the other places people came, one of the other big hubs was also Egypt. And so for the piece, I took some of these images, I took a subset of them. Oh, I'll show one more. This is another place. And again, these are the places where people do this work, the people who are tagging these data sets, where they do it. This is also from Venezuela. And what I did for the actual final result, I took these images and I presented them kind of in two modes. And what I was trying to get at was really, as I said, this reality of what it takes to have machine learning, these huge machine learning kind of technology at scale. First, I wanted to present the reality of what it looks like to have that. But then I kind of did these other stylized images where I was playing with that a little bit. And I was playing with this two things. One was this idea of who the future is for. And also I kind of was pulling in imagery and references from almost comic books, as if to kind of play with the idea of who's the hero, who's the protagonist of this story. So you can see an example here. That's the first one that I had showed you, which is just the image as it was on its own. And then these are like the more stylized version. This is another example. And you can see in each of these, I added these little slogans. I wanted to get at this idea of, again, like kind of a comic book thing, where it's just playing with that idea of perspective. I think when we're thinking about technology, really this question of audience, who are things for, who's the subject and who's the object, when we're thinking about any piece of technology? I think that is an incredibly important and revealing question, and it helps you really understand how things are situated. So what I did, I took that and then I ended up making this video where I pulled it together. The final result is a 23-minute long video. So clearly I'm not going to show all of it. And it was a video, but it was kind of coded in different ways. So what it did was it flipped between these two modes, where you can see the first mode is just the images as people submitted them, just exactly as they submitted it. And then the second one, it will flip to this kind of other version of it, where I'm kind of speaking to this other way of thinking about these. And this really ran in the background of Photographer's Gallery, where it's like the background of, I don't know if you could tell by that main photo, it's almost the background of like a coffee shop and window display. So it was really meant to be sort of this long looping piece. And it goes on for a while and it pulls together a lot of these different images. And again, plays with some of the language around this. So, okay, I think I'm gonna kind of wrap up around there. And again, I wanna just get at this idea of the future. And what I have seen in a lot of the work I've done is so often these technologies are presented as really new, but they follow some of these old patterns that are really just in alignment with industrial capitalism. And so here, those who are living in developed countries, we are presented as if the fruits of technological development manifest because of the hard work of entrepreneurs in our society, or because of researchers in our society, or because of whatever combination of things happening in our world. But really, those are only made possible because of the systematic extraction of resources from other regions of the world, and that leading from those countries to ours. And so I think, again, about this work that the narratives of these tools do. I think we should be very skeptical of these narratives of progress, which tend to repeat the same old story, and really consider, progress comes at the expense of those on the margins. Is it really progress? Is that the future we want? What does it look like to create that, given that this is the world that we live in? Okay, I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Your work really pushes the boundaries of what we think of the human error and how we encode this. And I think it's really important and also quite beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing with it. We have one question from the audience that says, what are some ways that people intentionally, maliciously distort the information that AI uses to understand the world? Or to put it another way, if I conceived convinced a bunch of people to falsely label pics of dogs and cats, could we make Google's computer vision more stupid?
That's great.
Yeah.
I think you would make it my glib answer wants to be you would make it just as stupid as it was all along. But really, I think the real thing, the thing that I find really interesting about that question is about this like intentionally and maliciously distorting the information. That is, in reality, it would take so many different chains to do this in some ways. But really, I do think that there are a lot of examples. So I'm a person who thinks a lot about data collection. I like to focus on the data because I think that is how that is like kind of the point where a lot of decisions are made. And there are lots of interesting examples of people playing with data or playing with omission or playing with like how they're represented to kind of change things down the line. And I think that in a way for me, I find that to be a really interesting point of thinking about this. And what I also like about this question is this idea of shifting like the focus of power, like who gets to have power, who gets to be like thinking about, I like how it puts the emphasis on the people who are labeling these data sets. I mean, in reality, the truth is places like Figure 8 have so many, as someone who registered on both sides, they have so many safeguards to make sure that nobody is labeling the data incorrectly, or that if you are labeling it incorrectly, that's not what's going to be used. But I do have this like dream and wonderful idea of people all like rising up together and deciding collectively that we are going to change the way in which some kind of digital system reads us or plays with this data, and then seeing what happens down the line. That is like a dream of mine. I'm so interested in that.
Yeah, I'm all for a future subversive machine learning movement. And it also begs the question of, as we move further and further into these systems that codify these these classifications that solidify them. What kind of agency do we have as individuals that are being tagged in those? On that, I'd be curious about, since you have been on kind of both sides of this when you've been researching, what do you see as the safeguards for us making sure that these data collections that are affecting our everyday lives, that we have a voice in them?
I mean, that's the question. That feels to me like the question that everyone is asking. And I wish I had a really, really good answer. I am mad if I did.
Well,
I don't know.
I think your work brings us to that question and expands our minds to think about that reality and that future. And I applaud it tremendously. I also want to just say that once again, that piece that you wrote in 538 is very important in regards to this, about at what point can we actually use this to convince people, and how does that dialogue continue? Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. For all of you who are listening, Mimi's in New York right now and has generously joined us. It's late right now. Yeah, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Next up, we have an amazing artist, Philipp Schmitt. Philipp is a Brooklyn-based artist addressing the automation and perception and notions of opacity in artificial intelligence. But it's not just artificial intelligence. He merges the philosophical, poetic, and political dimensions of computation by examining the ever-shifting discrepancy between what is computable in theory and in reality. His work has been exhibited around the world, and his latest project, Declassifier, can be seen online. And with that said, I would like to introduce Philipp Schmitt.
Thank you. Okay, I'm also gonna find the screen share. And you're seeing a black screen now?
Yep.
Looks good.
Yes, okay. The standard Zoom question. Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot, Matt, for the introduction, and also to Seabrook for coordinating the whole event, and Gray Area for having us. And yeah, thanks to Mimi too. I'm a really big fan of her work. The People's Guide to AI is what I have as required reading whenever I teach a class on this. So I really recommend getting a copy or looking at it online. Yeah, so my name is Philipp Schmitt. I'm a German artist and a designer, and I'm also in New York right now. And yeah, with these lofty words of computation and opacity, what interests me a lot is what can be computed as a concept, for example, vision. And yeah, I want to just show a couple of projects that I thought would work on Zoom. And start with this one, which is I got the opportunity to go to grad school in New York on a scholarship from the German government, and as part of that, I got to do an exhibition in the German embassy, the consulate in New York. And they have this really large painting in their lobby called Man Pacing by Michael Morgner, a German painter. And I took a picture of that, ran the picture through one of these off-the-shelf computer vision algorithms. And here you see kind of the results. So yeah, funny stuff. Obviously, this algorithm, this AI in air quotes, was not at all equipped to interpret this painting. But then I also thought, who is, because all these art histories are never coming from like a neutral or a natural lineage of events, and they're actually often informed and written by the same value systems and the same people who make this AI software too. But But yeah, what was more important about this project was that I took these frames, the bounding boxes of what the algorithms recognized, and made them out of wood and hung them in the gallery in front of the painting, exactly where it was specified by the computer vision algorithm they should be. And that I thought was to think about what the symbol does as a symbol, as an artifact, which I also thought was quite fitting, because an embassy is this space that is so loaded with symbolism itself and authority and kind of hierarchy and maybe processes that you're not always experiencing so explicitly. And yeah, the question for me really was, what does the bounding box, the colorful rectangle of computer vision, do for the technology semiotically? Because you have these color palettes and these bright RGB colors that are made to contrast with anything that is found in the real world, and they frame this thing they see with kind of authority, marking what's important and discarding everything around it. And it's also these super precise answers with these sharp corners that don't give any explanations. And especially, and this is relates to a lot of what Mimi talked about, is they don't show any of the work that makes AI actually work. All the contributions by people who are labeling data, but also before that, the people who are actually making the data, which is mostly involuntary, as their images are scraped from, for example, Flickr, like a photo sharing website. And yeah, since the computer cannot see, they basically recognize pixel formations in this frame that are sort of statistically similar to what the algorithm has seen before, what it has learned from, which always is based on these huge data sets, annotated training images that show the algorithm sort of what's what in the real world. And all of that, as I said, is generally invisible, and this incredible amount of work that goes into that is also unacknowledged. And I made a project around this as well, that I thought the usual process is a training data set becomes a machine learning model, and an algorithm that, for example, can take in an image and then spits out a bunch of labels, what it recognizes: dog, cat, knife. And I thought, somehow, could you reverse this? Could these labels that you get, these predictions, show you actually what data made this prediction? And a project that I made based on this is called Humans of AI. It is online. And whoops, I'm going to go there. It has three projects, three smaller pieces based on the COCO data set, which is one of these large image collections. So you'll see there's this image in the background. I'll refresh it so we can see it again. And oh, slow. It's going through one of these computer vision algorithms, but instead of showing the bounding box of what was recognized, my version shows all the images that made a contribution to this prediction. So this is called declassifier. And you'll see all the horses that went into recognizing a horse, and thereby, I think, trying to expose a little bit this myth of the magically intelligent machine, to highlight also that each prediction is kind of based on other people's past experience. And it's pretty slow right now because I think maybe I'm streaming, but I wanted to show is that you can see the full images, because these were, before it became a person training image, it was someone's photo. And sometimes there's kind of a comic reveal when you see the rest of what is omitted. Yeah, here we have another one. And what else I want to show is that you can see underneath each image that we also have credits. So this picture was taken by William's Kitchen Bath, and has a caption and an ID in the data set. But importantly, that information is not part of this data set that usually researchers would just download and use to train their algorithm. And I was able to basically reverse engineer that data set from one sort of field that was in there and recreated the entire thing and made, first of all, a certificate of appreciation for everyone that whose pictures are still online on Flickr, where this data was stolen from, really. And the reason for that is that most of the photographers in this data set, or the photos in this data set, require to be attributed, or they require to not be used commercially by license. But this is not respected in how this data is used. So here we have 34,000 certificates, and there's a lot of more people who have since removed their photos, though. So yeah, here's one for Marco Fieber, who generously, involuntarily contributed 3 photos to this data set. I mean, there is an amount of irony in this that I want to point out. So obviously, the certificate does not make things right. I meant to call out and point out the irony in all of this. The third piece of this within this project is a slideshow of 120,000, I think, pictures, and it's played back at the speed of kind of like a Christmas Eve family photo show, because originally that data set is this kind of strange mix of really everyday things, sometimes really bizarre stuff. There's violence, there's nudity, there's nice family moments, all kind of just scraped to train machines. And I thought at this speed, and the whole thing takes, I think, 6 days and 20 hours to watch. At this speed, you really restore this kind of human scale of it all. And as a whole image collection, it becomes this one-dimensional resource. But at this speed, and with the credits restored, you see this like personal histories and stories that are that make AI possible. Maybe this person had a really good match that day, and maybe we could think about what the conversation was here, etc. So 6 days of jam-packed entertainment for quarantine time. I'm going to move on to another project. This is a series of prints I made, prints of digital images, and during a residency with Runway, which is a software company in Brooklyn that makes tools to make it easier for creatives, for people who don't have like a programming background, to work or to try out machine learning models. And what I've discovered, kind of, what was something that I was playing around with their models and discovered this thing that I'm going to talk about. One other, so what you're seeing is a picture made with a machine learning model that is meant to turn photos to sketches. So you put in a photo, and out comes a version of it that kind of looks like, or tries to look like, it was hand-drawn. But what I discovered was that if you don't put in a photo, but you just put in a white square, and you run it through, what you get out is a white square. But then you put that square in again, and you get another one, and you put that in again, and over time, this kind of feedback loop happens, where the model introduces noise, and then just goes crazy. And this is where you get the images that you just saw or here in motion kind of over time. And I tried this out with a bunch of different models, and surprisingly, it was quite interesting with a lot of them. So this is a model to increase the resolution of photos. And then this last one is meant to colorize black and white pictures. And so I called this series Introspections, probably a bit too anthropomorphic, but I thought this was kind of showing revealing what the model wants, what it wants to see. So this colorization thing seems for me to wanting to look at the sky. Of course, it doesn't want anything, but it is related to this idea for me of AI as a black box, or people saying that AI would need to explain itself, which I don't think is a really helpful idea in general, because it becomes this excuse for bad engineering and software being deployed in harmful ways against marginalized communities without proper oversight. So that is how these things manifest. But I also thought it was interesting, and this will bring me to the next project, is how this idea of invisibility in AI, in machine learning, is handled in research with the people, by the people who actually make this technology. And I got to spend a lot of time actually last year, luckily, with researchers, AI researchers at NYU. And it was striking for me that for them, their work in its specific context is not at all a black box either. And it's also not abstract math, like as you might think, but it's really vivid for them. There's a lot of gesturing where you can sort of see that this person has something in front of them mentally. They draw a lot, everything is a whiteboard. And mental models, intuition, and imagination play a big role actually in this research. And I'm working on a couple projects right now in relation to that, but I want to show this small one that I made recently, also online. And you can visit this at curseofdimensionality.science. And when you visit this page, every time you visit, you'll get a generated collage of diagrams from research papers, from AI research papers, that mention terms related to high-dimensional space. So I wrote this script to get all these diagrams from open access machine learning journals. And the expression curse of dimensionality, which is the title of the project, refers to challenges that researchers have or anyone has of understanding high-dimensional spaces, mathematical spaces, beyond the 3D world we are kind of used to inhabiting or thinking in. And machine learning really relies fundamentally on high-dimensional representations of data. So I thought that, or what I wanted to ask with this project was that working in this space maybe requires of the scientist kind of an intuition for the unimaginable. And somewhere in there, I think, is this question of how engaging with this, both cognitively, like through thinking, but also in these visualizations and representations, how that relates to objectivity in science. Can you truly understand something that you cannot see or imagine, and also of which all these visualizations are only partial, like projections or proxies? And this is quite abstract, but I do think it relates somewhat to what is later expressed in this like mysticism of AI, that we cannot quite understand how this foreign thing makes its meaning. And I want to close with this last project, which is a coloring book called Learning to See. I made this for the New York Tech Scene Fair, which also Mimi Onuoha co-organized in 2018, I think. Maybe there'll be another one in the future. But Learning to See is a coloring book of images from computer vision training data sets, also processed again through these algorithms. You see, this is what I always do. And yeah, here we have a cat in the sink. And I worked with an illustrator to turn these pictures into coloring sketches. But what it, for me, what's interesting about this is I'm really interested is how computer vision might come to influence our human vision. Because if you think about it, in more and more aspects of life are really just being infiltrated by these techniques and technologies, and we are really just subjected to this stuff. It's not a choice. And then the somewhat completely unscientific take that I'm taking here is that human vision evolved over millennia to spot predators, snakes and stuff. But nowadays, maybe these predators are increasingly AI systems, autonomous machine learning, what have yous. And their hunting grounds are maybe targeted advertising or autonomous driving or policing. And so the idea would be that it would be an advantage to understand the logic by which these systems process the world. If I can intuitively anticipate how the self-driving car will cut the corner and will see me or not, and I will know what to do, I might have a higher chance of survival, an evolutionary advantage. And hence this coloring book as a somewhat ironic evolutionary nudge from a savvy parent. And with that, I want to say thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Quite amazing compliment to Mimi's presentation. In your work, it seems though that you have this pathway for showcasing the deconstruction of these artificial intelligence or machine learning symbols and revaluing them. Like in machine learning, it's commonplace to just kind of wrap the entire data set up as a companion library, and then all that value then goes into its output. I'm curious, by showcasing all of the work that goes into this and by highlighting it and playing with ways in which we value attribution, how is your work received among the scientists and the researchers that you've worked with?
Thank you. Well, I guess implicit in the question was related to the Humans of AI project. And I actually spent for this one a lot of time thinking about what is my responsibility with this, in terms of revealing, for example, the Flickr users that were kind of whose pictures were used in the data set. And yeah, that was something that I worried a lot about. From the researchers, I think on the more on terms of like attribution and this being right or not, you tend to not get, or I tended to not get many responses, or kind of this being legitimized as how things are done. And what people are interested in, though, was to see this declassifier as maybe a technique of visualization, or for how these classifications work. And that, I guess, could tie in with, there's now more and more work in sort of like an interpretability or explainability, or under these terms, research into AI. So into machine learning systems to understand better how they work and how they are biased, how they make decisions. So I guess that could speak to that, though I wouldn't call this like a research project with the rigor that you would need, I think, to use this in that way.
Definitely. And I have one other question, which is, in kind of highlighting the process of even showcasing whiteboards and symbols that go into the creation of these concepts and their application, how is your own process in trying to rebel against that? And how do you make sure that you don't get into that same system when working with these tools? Is this something that you're cognitively aware of, that you actively push against, or is this something where you explore the tool as it's meant to be?
Well, I think I'm biased in my ways, that's for sure, in terms of what I've experienced and read. So I wouldn't say like I'm completely out of this. And by using that technology, I think you're also automatically somehow indoctrinated into those views. And also in terms of, if you want to draw something with code, it's much easier to do a rectangle than a circle. So you're also thinking like visually, you're thinking in these terms automatically. And what else did I want to say? Oh, and I think I still noticed though that I am kind of at NYU for sure. I am the stranger who is not familiar with a lot of what is taken for granted. So that's how I notice that, well, this is interesting, that how we are describing this empty room is using the vocabulary you use to describe data, which maybe, you stumble across these things that you don't understand. So I think that's really valuable to bring in as many people as possible from different backgrounds.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love your work. I think you should definitely continue to explore how we can deconstruct all of these data sets that are around us, and even think about the conceptual efforts that go into creating these. Thank you so much for joining us. Also, Philipp is in New York right now. So once again, thank you for staying up late and joining us for this on the East Coast, on the West Coast.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Okay, next up and last but not least, we have Toby Schachman. Maybe we can get Toby here. Hey, Toby.
Hey.
Toby is an artist, designer, researcher, tool maker, who, going from Mimi, who is looking at the human effort that goes into these data collection and the data around us, to Philipp, who looks at the symbols that actually compile into this data collection itself. Toby's focused his whole career around the idea of symbolic reasoning versus spatial thinking. And this idea that we kind of are stuck in these symbolic reasoning interfaces. And how can we free ourselves to be more creative by creating environments that allow for more flexibility, tangibility, and in essence, a better understanding about the information that we're being presented with. With that said, I'd love to introduce Toby.
Thank you, Matt. I will share the screen. All right, we're all in. So once again, thanks, Matt. Thank you, Gray Area. and Mimi and Philip. So I'm Toby Schachman. I'm an artist and programmer and sort of interaction designer, developer. Something that I think is very strange to be doing these Zoom presentations. Something that I noticed when I was preparing the slides for this was how much the venues, like where this artwork was shown, or the circumstances under which it was made, depended so much on being around other people. So I mean, even in this photograph on screen, like, you know, this is at an art show with like lots of people and like that energy, and it's something that Gray Area has. And you know, it's wonderful that these venues exist, and it's I don't know if other artists feel this way, but like without that pulling the artwork out of us, like it's going to be a very strange, you know, upcoming future. And hope I'm looking forward to when we can all be in person again. All right. Well, that being said, this is a piece called Infinite Sympathy. It's a kaleidoscope that has you can look through on both sides. It's for two people to see each other's eyes reflected like this. I just wanted to open with this because I think it goes with the theme of how we see, which you know, is important in both of the previous speakers and certainly in my own work. And you know, how we see, and can art and can our tools help us gain new perspectives. So Matt asked me to talk about my own practice in regards to my art making and my tool making. Both of these inform each other, and I'll be jumping back and forth between them. Additionally, the idea of physical things versus digital things is also a theme in my work, and I'm constantly flipping back and forth. So for example, in the previous piece, when I was using mirrors, that was sort of inspired by doing a lot of sort of interactive video pieces. And that's something that you do on the screen, and you know, it might involve a camera or some sort of sensor, and you're taking that sensor, processing it in some way, feeding it back to the viewer. So I was doing all these digital pieces with video, and I was like, well, can these be done using analog filters, which, for example, mirrors or lenses? This is a piece called Sphere of Water. In the piece, you see in front of you this floating sphere of water. I drew this little schematic just to show how it works. But you know, there's a sort of a tapered kaleidoscope here, which turns a bucket of water into this sort of image. And there's a mirror here, which turns sort of reverses gravity so that the sphere appears to be floating in water. And that's what you see. So you know, I'm trying to use computers and physical media to just sort of transform perspectives, see how far we can bend our perspectives. At the same time, I'm, as I was developing those other pieces, I was very cognizant of, on the computer, how we're the tools that we have sort of privilege certain ways of thinking for doing certain tasks. So this is a part of an essay by Brett Victor, and he's pointing out that, you know, if you're making a static artwork on a computer, you have an interface that looks like this, where you're drawing the thing. It's, you know, it's on the screen, but it's still sort of engaging you in the same way that you would use a physical medium like pen and paper. Sort of the same with animation. You can map out your keyframes and whatnot. But then as soon as you get to something like this, which is an image that changes, is a generative image that changes every time you click on it, then your interface looks like this. And same with interactive things. All of a sudden you're in this coding world, which is so different than direct manipulation. And this is also something that I was experiencing with making the physical pieces with mirrors, is a very different tactile experience than coding the video filters. So that inspired me to see if I could take some of these coding interfaces and could I make them more like a direct manipulation interface. This is a programming language I found called context free, where you sort of, you write code and it generates these images using recursion. And I realized that I could make a direct manipulation interface that had the same semantics or the same power as the context-free programming language. So here you're able to create these shapes by dragging them out onto a canvas. But in addition to using shapes you've previously made, you can also use the shape itself. So I've included this shape as a heart along with a copy of the whole image. So it's a recursive image. And another example, I'll create a rectangle and then drag that rectangle out onto itself to create a branch, and then drag another branch, and then you get sort of this, it doubles on every iteration through this recursion, then you get a tree. I continued developing this line of thinking in another project called Apparatus. So this was a tool for drawing interactive diagrams. There's a video showing a few of the things that people made with it. Sort of the idea was that you could draw with it the way you would in like Adobe Illustrator or vector editor, but then you could also apply these essentially sort of a spreadsheet data flow programming model on top. And then you create these relationships between shapes, which allows you to make interactive diagrams. So I guess here we're making some sliders and then making a color picker using the sliders. So yeah, I mean, you can make all these things with typing out long blocks of code, but the thing that was interesting to me was, can you make it feel more like a graphical editor and be able to apply your spatial thinking in tandem with the symbolic thinking that is programming, status quo programming right now. Something that came out of that work was I had made it to make interactive diagrams, but then I found that it was also useful for making making physical shapes that required a sort of programmatic thinking as well as visual thinking. So this is a zoetrope that I made. A zoetrope is usually it's something that spins and then something that flashes or only lets you see certain frames. So I had these LED lights which would blink exactly when the disk had rotated one frame. And so you end up seeing this animation. And I made several other sort of records for this. But something that struck me was this, would not have been able to make this shape, I think, without the tool that I had made, without having had Apparatus. So this was very exciting to me that, I was able to create an art piece that was truly dependent on having created a tool. And this is sort of like, I guess this is my practice, right? It's like creating art and it's creating tools and feeding those back on each other. So the tool was used both for creating this sort of display piece, as well as laying out all of the laser cut pieces, which then actually constitute the mechanism of the zoetrope. So things like just these little pieces that hold the sensors in the right place, hold the motor in the right place, and everything. And so, yeah, so like physical and digital, I guess having seen that, I wanted to continue exploring that and create another iteration. So after recursive drawing and apparatus, make another tool that was specifically made for creating these kinds of physical pieces, and specifically for use with digital fabrication machines like laser cutters and digital die cutters. So now I'd like to speak about an art piece, another example of an art piece developed in tandem with the tool that was used to make the art piece. So these are the sun seeds. This project is a collaboration with Ryan Alexander and Monique DeSalvo. These are made out of sort of thin, flexible dichroic pieces. Dichroic is the term for these. It changes color depending on what angle you look at it. So that's why it's all rainbowy. This is showing how they come together. So it's a bunch of pieces that interlock. And to design all of these shapes, I wanted to make a program that would give me sort of the expressiveness of a vector editor like Illustrator, while still allowing me to employ programmatic capabilities. So in this case, performing a rotation to enforce certain symmetries that we needed. So this is just showing the process of making one of these shapes. Here it is in the program. Here it is cut out on a Cricut cutting machine. So an important part of this is that the pieces need to interlock together and have space in between so that they actually come together. So here is me visualizing that. Here's visualizing what the sort of flower vertex is going to look like. This is all of the pieces together. And I designed this so that all of those things could be visualized and edited within the context of seeing it. So here, I guess I'm showing sort of changing the leaf or petal shape and seeing it replicated across my whole design, both in how the flower looks and making sure that they fit together and how they're all going to be laid out on the cutting machine. And just to show the pieces that come together. So there's essentially this curve, which I wanted a lot of expressive control over. And then that's mirrored. Then that petal shape is then used to, is replicated twice at 2 different scales to create this shape. That's replicated 3 times to create this triangle shape. And then I wanted to be able to visualize how 5 of these pieces would come together so that I could see this flower shape. And then that's the final piece. this work was developed at Stochastic Labs over a 2-month residency. If you're not familiar with Stochastic Labs, I would encourage you to check it out, especially if you're into gray area, you'd be into Stochastic Labs. They're a residency program in Berkeley that is just a fantastic community and a fantastic space. So I held a workshop at the end of that residency where participants used the tool that I had created, which is called Cuttle. Cuttle, and so they used the tool to make their own creations, and we cut them out we had a bunch of these Cricut cutters for cutting out cardstock. Ryan, Monique, and I also decided to try doing a crowdfunding campaign for making these sun seeds as kits. So that was a trip. We did a ton of, in-house manufacturing to create. This is probably like half of the orders. Like we just had to make so many of these things. But it was a lot of fun, and it seemed like a lot of the people who received the kits were really into it. So that was a super fun project. If you ever want to do a crowdfunding campaign, I encourage you to do it, and just know that it'll be more work than you expect, which is what everyone tells you. And then these are the final sun seeds, which were sold as kits on that crowdfunding campaign. I hope the video is coming through without too much degradation through all the layers of Zoom.
It looks great.
Thanks, Matt. So Cuttle is currently what I'm working on. If you do art with laser cutters or with die cutters or any kind of cutters, you might be interested in it. We haven't launched officially yet, but if you go to cuttle.xyz, you can, there's a mailing list that you can sign up on. And also all of the work that I showed is on my website, tobyschachman.com, as well as my email address and all that if you want to get in touch. So that is my presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to play with that, and I will encourage you to, because it's really fun. I've actually been fortunate enough to both build one of the succulents, which is one of the sun seeds, and also use Cuttle for laser cutting. It's a fantastic tool. I wanted to ask you, it seems like throughout all of these, you're pushing and trying to change how we create and how we think about computation. And what is the order of that process? Do you have a utopic vision for what spatial thinking ends up being? Is there something that you feel like is the kind of ultimate spatial thinking device, or something that you're striving towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is like, so I have a programming background. Like I've been programming since I was a kid, so I always sort of took it for granted that that was just a thing that could be done. And actually, when I went to ITP at NYU, which is a great program for anyone in this community, also, I'm sure most people know about it. That was where like I just encountered so many people who are coming from like an arts background and doing programming for the first time, and like seeing all of the ways that all the different kinds of intelligence that people bring from their own background and sort of seeing how sometimes that was such a poor match for the tools that we have for programming. So I mean, my utopic vision is, I suppose, that people are able to bring the intelligence, you know, that they've developed and be able to use that with computation, not having to change, not having to switch, right? So like, you know, when you're programming a graphic thing, like you're thinking about it as a shape or a drawing, and then you need to translate that to code. So I'm interested in like, what if you didn't need to translate that to code? What if code could be a drawing? Or, you know, however you're thinking about it, you know, whether that's dance or architecture, like any kind of discipline, how can we meld that with computation?
I love that. And we have one more question from the crowd. Do you see integrating machine learning with CAD tools like Apparatus or Cuddle? What would that look like?
So my opinions on that are, I think that I'm a big fan of understandability. So I think it's really important that people are able to understand how their tools work, you know, at sort of all the layers if they want to. And so one very problematic thing with machine learning is that, at least currently, it can be very difficult to understand what is happening. Like why a, you know, an algorithm sees a horse here. It's and like, I think something that was shown in our previous two speakers was like, it's really interesting when, you know, it gets it wrong, right? Because you can sort of see that helps you understand it, really, is like seeing what it gets wrong. But anyway, so what I was saying was that understandability is very important to me. And so insofar as we can integrate machine learning into our creative tools in a way that we can get a really good intuitive understanding of what the tool is doing, I think that that's great. And, you know, in fact, like Apparatus uses some sort of, I guess, it uses like back solving, like to figure out how sort of how the program needs to change when you drag something. And I would consider this sort of like a machine learning technique, not to go too into specifics. So, but yeah, I mean, like that's the point, right? Is to like a symbiosis between human intelligence and machine intelligence. And my only caveat is, when we're using machine intelligence, it's super important to be able to understand what the machine is doing.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think the value of grokking the tool that you're playing with, that only helps exponentially with the creative output that you result with, and that it seems to be something that we, or at least and modern machine learning praise, is something that we don't really value as much. And I really appreciate your tools trying to, from a very low level, try to reconstruct how we approach technology and how we approach our own process and our own creative development with technology. Thank you so much for sharing. And I hope all of you check out Cuddle and its future launch. Very excited about that. With that said, I hope you all enjoyed the three artists here today. We've seen a lot of different works around input into computation, whether it be the human efforts and human errors that go into how we analyze imagery or data sets, whether it be the deconstruction of those symbols and the values that went into the creations of those David sets, or even looking at how we manipulate, create, or challenge our own creativity utilizing these programmatic environments. I hope you can all see that these three artists are challenging notions and ways that push the boundaries of existing tools. And I'm very excited to see where they go from here. I wanted to thank you all for joining, and there will be another one of these that we'll be announcing soon. And I just want to remind you, there is a donation link that you can donate to support the artists. And if there are no further questions, I want to say thank you so much and have a great night.